Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aikin.
And I'm Robert Talisse.
These are 15-minute conversations between two philosophy professors. We limit it really to our attention spans because we jump around. We have lots of interests and things like that. We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason. And we're also the authors of Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about something that Rob's been putting his head to quite a bit these days, and it's about political polarization and the way that it can be destructive of our contemporary discourse, and it operates on us in ways that we don't even seem to be able to pick up. A lot of the ways that we even seem to talk about polarization is that we live in these sort of information silos. And one thought that seems to be around, and one of the things that we've espoused a couple times, is that we're supposed to get out of the silos and kind of taste around and get a lot of voices in our ears to, at the very least, arrest that polarization. Rob, will you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
So take a step back. Surely, if you're watching this, you've probably also read or seen or turned on the news recently to encounter somebody warning us about polarization and writing about how the electoral results from a couple weeks back reveal, something that they're now calling hyperpolarization. And in a lot of this commentary, despite the agreement, it seems to run across the political spectrum that polarization is especially punctuated in the country, the United States at least these days, and polarization is some kind of distinctive problem for democracy. There's surprisingly very little said about what exactly we mean when we're talking about polarization. Now, commonly, what is being lamented when people raise the polarization as something to worry about is a kind of log jamming or the falling out of the common ground on the basis of which politically opposed office holders and politically opposed parties would be able to compromise or productively work together to govern. So a kind of political intransigence and the falling out of moderate middle ground holders is typically thought to be the problem. But note, we can go back to Tocqueville or to the Federalist and think that, maybe that's not such a problem, right? Maybe there's a certain degree of conflict among power holders and officials. Maybe there's a kind of democratic benefit to the absence of their ability to get along on too much or to agree on too much, because that makes large-scale changes kind of hard to make, hard-fought, slow to come, and I don't think you have to be a conservative in any objectionable political sense to just say, maybe certain kinds of changes are, even if they're overall in the right direction, are badly instituted when they're too drastic and are made too quickly. So what seems to be problematic about polarization then can't simply be, right, the falling out of the middle ground. Can't simply be that.
Yeah. And it doesn't make this a uniquely bad time either. Right?
That's right.
The fact that it shows up in the Federalist Papers as one of the sort of the significant features of the way that the Constitution is supposed to be set up is to manage that is pretty good evidence of the fact that if that was at the forefront of Hamilton and Madison's mind, then that's that. Then it's one that's not a transient kind of phenomenon.
That's right. So what does seem to be the real problem is that the kind of polarization or the degree of polarization in that sort of political sense, the distance between the opposing parties, seems to be driven by this other phenomenon, which is also called polarization, but is quite distinct because it's epistemic in some very broad sense of that term. So what's sometimes called group polarization, but I think probably better called belief polarization, is this phenomenon by which we, by means of certain kinds of interactions and transactions with others, we become more extreme versions of ourselves. And so watchers of earlier episodes of this podcast will be familiar with some of the cases, and if you've picked up a Cass Sunstein book or looked online much for this stuff about silos and bubbles and enclaves and things, you're probably familiar with some of these examples. You get a bunch of opponents to capital punishment together to talk about their opposition to capital punishment, and as they talk together about the thing that they agree on, the members come to hold a more radical or extreme version of the opposition to capital punishment. Now, what that means can be measured in various ways. One way to see an obvious metric is to think about these jury experiments. You get a jury that's convinced of that the guy's guilty. The longer they talk about the guilt of the guy, the more severely they want to punish him. And in fact, members of deliberating juries, once they've come to an agreed verdict, they're likely at the end to endorse a more extreme punishment after talking to others than the punishment that they would have recommended as the most permissible extreme before the jury started to deliberate. So we
bump the ceiling.
Yeah,
right.
So we poll you and say, Scott, if this guy's guilty, what do you think the worst he should get is?
This level.
Yeah, say, $5,000 fine, right? After talking, you become ready to impose, $50,000 punitive damage award on him. And so it looks as if a certain kind of like-minded discussion makes us more extreme in that sense. We come to hold more extreme contents of the thing that we believe. We also become, in some ways, more fervent in our convictions. Even though we've shifted to a new content, we tend to hold that new content with a higher level of confidence than the level of confidence with which we held the previous belief. And that is measurable because after this shift to the more extreme content takes place, we're also more likely to endorse riskier forms of behavior on behalf of that belief.
Got it.
Right?
So the content changes and the degree of the belief changes.
Well, it's not clear whether it's right to say the degree of the belief, because the belief's contents change.
Yeah,
it's more
right,
something like you become a more ardent or fervent or confident advocate of your position.
Yes.
Than you were when you held the different and more moderate position that you endorsed earlier.
Okay.
So there's some attitudinal sort of emboldening that happens. And that's because, you get a bunch of people together who think that, for example, in one experiment, the police have committed some terrible act of brutality against a community member. You get people before they get together to talk about what they should do, and they have more moderate views about the severity of the infraction, more moderate views about what justice demands by way of repair for this infraction. They talk together. They come to hold the view that the violation was far more serious, an injustice. What is owed by way of repair to the violator is something much more punitive. And after discussion, individuals become more willing to engage in extra legal means of protest. So they become riskier in what they're willing to, or they become more willing to engage in risky behavior on behalf of their judgment. Okay.
So now here's the question: is there a way to arrest this?
Well, let me just say one point of this, because it's still like, okay, so we're doxastically less in control of ourselves and all the rest. Maybe that's bad news, but maybe that's just bad news if you're a philosopher and you've got a view of yourself as a rational creature. One, I think, dimension of the problem that polarization in this sort of belief sense raises for us is polarization not only impacts our own beliefs, polarization also affects our views of other people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Not only in impacting what we believe, it impacts what we believe about others.
That's right.
Right. And why wouldn't it? I mean,
That's kind of how belief works, right? It's like if you believe that P, you'd think that folks who believe not P are wrong, right? So the stronger you believe P.
That's right. Yeah. Or the more radical content you hold with respect to the P issue.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
The more, so the polarization phenomenon in this sense then sets into motion a broader dynamic by which not only do we turn into more extreme versions of ourselves, but we come to demand and require more homogeneity with the people that we're willing to see as our allies. So we come to hold a particular view about the people who agree with us. They have to agree with us more strongly, more firmly, and more across the board.
So it has a momentum effect.
That's right. And more homogeneity, right? But think about how the term rhino works. Yeah. Right, Republican in name only, that the group itself has to become more homogenized. And at the same time, again, this is just to be expected given how beliefs work, the people who don't agree with us become more alien, unintelligible, harder to recognize as engaged reasoners, harder to see as denizens in the space of reasons. More of what they do looks puzzling and irrational to us, and more of their behavior looks diagnosable by us by reference to their political commitments, the things with respect to which we see them as our opponents. Right. So drinking out of a Charlie Brown mug might have start looking to you like a signal of what a certain kind of politically intoned professor of philosophy does. Maybe, maybe not. Anyhow, that's really the problem of polarization. It's not the sort of separation of the two sides, the falling out of the common ground. It's not necessarily any of those things, or not solely any of those things. The problem of polarization is that it's degenerative. The problem of polarization is that polarization is a phenomenon by which we become less able to see within the space of reasons room for reasoned political debate.
So one quick question about this is that could political polarization be a phenomenon of, you might say, looking where the lights are on? So one example could be that, look, after you talk with a bunch of like-minded folks, you just have more evidence for your view. So you might say, look, in some ways it's a hasty generalization. You in some ways have more evidence after talking with these folks. And so of course your view gets stronger. Your view maybe get pushed to one extreme. Why? Because you get more considerations that are in favor of that. So in some ways it's just, you might say, an evidence selection problem. And so that's just something that arises because of the fact that we talk with folks that we agree with. So
right. So let's just say that's one version of what we might think of as an informational theory of belief polarization. And informational here is used in a philosophically unsophisticated sense because we're not talking about evidence here in any way that would add to your reason to believe that P. We're just talking about new instances, right? So
well, that's different then.
That'll be different. Okay, because look, one thing that seems to be going on one thing that we're vulnerable to, we know, is that we systematically overestimate the evidentiary value of new considerations that are offered, that we encounter for the things we already believe.
Right.
We systematically somebody says something new in favor of the thing that we already believe, we think that new thing has got a high degree of epistemic value.
Right.
Much higher than, in fact, it may have.
So one hypothesis would be then that the polarization phenomenon is just a manifestation of confirmation bias.
Right.
Okay.
What I think we should talk about in the next episode is why that can't be the whole story.
Boy, that's going to have to convince me of something. I'm going to have some new information. Don't give me something that supports my view.
It's Philosophy15, folks. We're gonna fire up another episode on this informational account of the belief polarization phenomenon.
Just click next.